There are people in Hollywood who dislike each other quietly, professionally, keeping their feelings tucked behind polished smiles and careful public statements. And then there are the deeper, more complicated feelings, the ones that build slowly over years of witnessing things that cannot be unseen and enduring behavior that cannot be forgotten. Lucille Ball was one of the most beloved figures in the entire history of American entertainment, a woman who built an empire through talent, discipline, and an iron will that our industry consistently underestimated. She was funny, yes, but she was also fiercely intelligent, deeply principled, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to how she believed people deserved to be treated. She had seen everything Hollywood had to offer over the course of her extraordinary career: the brilliance and the pettiness, the generosity and the cruelty, the public performances and the private realities that existed behind them. She kept most of her opinions about other people to herself, because that was the kind of professional she was. But there was one person in her life whose behavior disturbed her on a level that went beyond ordinary professional friction or personal incompatibility. One person whose conduct she found genuinely unforgivable. And the story of why she felt that way reveals something important not just about Lucille Ball, but about the hidden world of Hollywood that the audience never got to see. To understand the depth of what Lucille Ball felt, you first have to understand who she was and what she stood for, because her values weren't abstract principles she recited in interviews. They were convictions she had earned through decades of hard experience in one of the most brutal industries in the world. Lucille Ball arrived in Hollywood as a young woman with little money, no connections, and no guarantee of anything except her own determination. She spent years in the margins of the film industry, taking small parts, being overlooked, being told in 100 different ways that she wasn't quite what the studios were looking for. She survived that period through sheer professional discipline. She was always on time. She always knew her lines. She always treated the people she worked with, from the directors down to the crew members whose names most stars never bothered to learn, with consistent respect and decency. Those habits weren't strategies. They were expressions of who she genuinely was. When success finally came to Lucille Ball, it came spectacularly. I Love Lucy transformed American television and made her one of the most recognized faces on the planet. But the success didn't change her fundamental character. She still remembered what it felt like to be the person at the bottom of the hierarchy, the person whose livelihood depended entirely on the goodwill of people with more power. That memory made her fiercely protective of the people who worked for and around her. She had a well-documented reputation for looking out for her crew, for standing up when she saw someone being mistreated, for using her considerable influence to protect people who had no protection of their own. This was not a public relations position. The people who worked with her over the decades spoke about it consistently, the same qualities showing up again and again in how she conducted herself behind closed doors where no one was watching and no cameras were rolling. That foundational decency is what made her feelings about Desi Arnaz so layered and so painful. Because Desi wasn't a stranger she had observed from a distance and formed a cold judgment about. He was the man she had loved, the man she had built something extraordinary with, the man whose talent and charisma she had genuinely admired, and the man whose private behavior had caused her a kind of damage that she carried for the rest of her life. The relationship between Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz is one of the most complicated love stories in Hollywood history, because it contained genuine greatness and genuine destruction in equal measure, and separating the two was something Lucy struggled with for the rest of her days. When they met in 1940, Lucy was already an established presence in Hollywood, and Desi was a young Cuban musician whose infectious energy and natural charm made everyone in any room he entered feel his presence immediately. Their attraction was immediate and undeniable. People who knew them in those early years described a genuine, almost overwhelming connection between them, two strong personalities who brought out both the best and the worst in each other from the very beginning. They married the same year they met, and almost immediately the complications began. Their careers pulled them in different directions. Their personalities, both of them strong-willed, both of them accustomed to being the most magnetic person in any room, created friction that love alone couldn't always smooth over. But they persisted because what they had together felt worth persisting for. The creation of I Love Lucy in 1951 represented something genuinely remarkable in television history, and Desi Arnaz deserves real credit for much of what made it possible. When CBS was reluctant to cast Desi as Lucy's husband on the show, believing audiences wouldn't accept a Cuban man in that role, it was Desi who pushed back, who insisted, who ultimately helped make the case that the show needed to be built around their real marriage if it was going to work at all. Beyond the casting fight, Desi brought extraordinary business acumen to the project. He and Lucy formed Desilu Productions together, and it was Desi who pioneered the use of multiple cameras to film before a live studio audience, a technique that fundamentally changed how television comedy was made and is still used today. He understood the business of entertainment in ways that many people around him didn't, and he used that understanding to protect what he and Lucy were building together. But the professional partnership that worked so brilliantly existed alongside a private marriage that was fracturing in ways the public never saw. Desi's personal behavior behind closed doors stood in devastating contrast to the competent, charming man audiences watched on screen every week. The stories that emerged over the years, many of them from Lucy herself in her private conversations with close friends and later in more guarded public statements, painted a picture of a man who treated the sanctuary of his marriage with a carelessness that bordered on contempt. The drinking was serious and consistent. Desi struggled with alcohol throughout their marriage in ways that affected not just his own behavior, but the atmosphere of their entire household. Lucy had grown up in circumstances that gave her a deep aversion to instability and unpredictability, and living with someone whose relationship with alcohol created a constant undercurrent of uncertainty was something that wore on her in ways that didn't show up on screen but were very real in her daily life. Far more damaging were the infidelities. Desi Arnaz was not discreet about his unfaithfulness, and that lack of discretion made the situation even more humiliating for Lucy. In an industry full of gossip and whisper networks, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, his behavior became something that people talked about openly while Lucy was expected to maintain the public image of a happy, functioning marriage. She was performing a love story on screen with a man who was betraying her trust off it, and doing so in ways that were visible enough that she couldn't pretend she didn't know what was happening. That kind of sustained public humiliation leaves marks that don't heal cleanly, and Lucy was not the kind of woman who could simply compartmentalize her way past it. What made everything even more complicated was that Lucy did love him. People who knew her well have spoken about this consistently over the years. Her feelings for Desi were genuine and deep, and the betrayal hurt precisely because the love was real. She wasn't a woman who had entered the marriage with illusions about who he was. She had chosen him fully and deliberately, and watching him make choices that dismantled what they were building together was a grief that ran alongside the anger and the humiliation rather than being replaced by them. By the time their marriage ended in 1960, after 20 years together, Lucy had been through an emotional experience that most people never have to face at quite that scale. The collapse of something that had been both a great love and a remarkable professional partnership, all played out in front of an industry and a public that had made their relationship part of its own mythology. The divorce itself was described by people close to both of them as deeply painful on both sides. Lucy had not wanted it to come to that conclusion. She had tried, more times and with more patience than most people would have extended, to find a way through the problems in their marriage. But there are limits to what any person can endure, and she had finally reached hers. What followed the divorce was a period of painful adjustment for Lucy, who had to disentangle her personal life from a professional partnership that was still very much alive and still very much central to her career. Desilu Productions continued to exist after the marriage ended, and Lucy and Desi had to find a way to work together in the aftermath of everything that had happened between them. That transition required a kind of emotional discipline that most people would have found nearly impossible to sustain. Lucy eventually bought out Desi's share of Desilu Productions in 1962, becoming the sole owner and the first woman to run a major Hollywood studio, an achievement that was as historic as anything else in her extraordinary career. But even that triumph came wrapped in the complicated emotions of what had preceded it. She had built something remarkable with Desi. She had also survived something damaging with him. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the truth of them lived together inside her in ways that she never fully resolved. Friends who knew her in the years after the divorce spoke about how she could reference Desi with warmth in one breath and with something harder and more guarded in the next. The love didn't disappear, but neither did the wounds. What Lucy found most difficult to forgive, according to people who were close to her during those years, wasn't simply the infidelity or the drinking in isolation. It was what those things represented. It was the gap between the man Desi presented to the world and the man he was in private. Lucy had built her entire professional reputation on authenticity, on being genuinely herself in front of the camera, on a kind of honesty in her work that audiences could feel. The distance between Desi's public image and his private reality felt like a fundamental dishonesty that cut against everything she believed in and everything she had worked to build. She could forgive human weakness. She had more capacity for understanding and compassion than people sometimes gave her credit for. What she struggled to forgive was the sustained performance of something he wasn't living up to in private. There were also specific incidents that stayed with Lucy long after the marriage ended, moments that crystallized for her exactly what the fundamental problem was. People who worked on I Love Lucy during its peak years have spoken in various interviews and memoirs about the atmosphere behind the scenes, about the tension that could exist between the professional brilliance of what they were creating together and the personal difficulties that ran underneath it. Lucy was a consummate professional on set, focused, prepared, committed to getting the work right. When Desi's personal behavior interfered with the professional work they had both devoted themselves to building, it created a kind of anger in her that was distinct from the personal hurt. She had learned through hard years of discipline and dedication that the work mattered, that you showed up and you did the job and you gave it everything you had. Watching someone with genuine talent and genuine ability make choices that undermined all of that was something she found very difficult to accept. The years after the divorce brought Lucy to a different kind of stability. She married comedian Gary Morton in 1961, and by all accounts the relationship gave her something she had not had in her first marriage, a steadiness and a reliability that allowed her to feel genuinely secure for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Gary was not Desi. He didn't have Desi's particular magnetism or his business brilliance or the complicated chemistry that had made the first marriage both extraordinary and destructive. But he was consistent. He was faithful. He was present in the ways that mattered most to Lucy after everything she had been through. People who knew her during the Morton years described a woman who was genuinely happier and more at ease than she had been during much of her first marriage, even during the periods of that marriage that had looked from the outside like happiness. But Desi Arnaz never fully left her emotional landscape, because the story they had built together was too large and too significant to simply fade into the background. I Love Lucy remained part of the cultural conversation throughout the rest of Lucy's life, syndicated endlessly, celebrated constantly, the subject of retrospectives and tributes that inevitably brought Desi's name back into proximity with hers. She handled those situations with the professionalism that had always defined her public conduct. She could speak graciously about what they had accomplished together, because what they had accomplished together genuinely deserved gracious acknowledgement. But the people closest to her knew that the graciousness existed alongside feelings that were considerably more complicated. Late in her life, Lucy gave several interviews in which she spoke with more candor than she had in earlier years about the difficulty of her first marriage. She didn't traffic in bitterness or public accusations. That wasn't her style, and she was too intelligent to reduce something as complex as what she and Desi had shared to simple recriminations. But she was honest about the pain it had caused her, about the ways in which loving someone who repeatedly chose his own impulses over the well-being of their marriage had left marks that time had softened but not entirely erased. She spoke about the loneliness of being publicly partnered with someone while feeling privately alone, about the exhaustion of sustaining a performance of happiness for an audience while living a different reality at home. What makes the story of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz so enduring and so genuinely moving is that it refuses to reduce itself to a simple narrative. Desi Arnaz was not simply a villain in Lucy's story. He was a genuinely talented, genuinely creative man who made real and lasting contributions to the art form they built together, and who also made choices that caused the person he loved profound and lasting harm. Lucy was not simply a victim. She was a powerful woman who loved someone complicated, who fought for that relationship longer than most people would have, who ultimately made the difficult decision to protect herself when the cost of staying became too high, and who then went on to build something even larger and more historically significant on her own. Both of those things are true. The feelings,